Hi there, and thank you for tuning in. I'm currently working on a review of this Viltrox adapter for the Nikon Z mount, and it dawned on me that maybe not all of you out there know the story behind this adapter and why you would need it. So this video is for you in that case, and I'm also going to talk a little bit about the Nikon products and their history. So if you find that interesting and you want to hear that story, this video is for you. If you are an experienced Nikon shooter, I doubt there will be anything useful for you in this video. So I kindly ask you to consider to check out, because otherwise you may just be wasting your time. So with that disclaimer, let's get right into it. Just after the Earth cooled down and man started walking on Earth, Nikon invented something called the F-mount. And the F-mount is what you see here. It is just a way or an interface between your glass and your camera. This is an analog camera. It's made for film, and this F-mount was happily used for many years for film cameras. And there were changes to it over the time, but to a very large extent, most of the cameras are backwards compatible, meaning that you can use almost any glass on a Nikon camera with the F-mount. There are exceptions, pre-AI and all that, but let's just stick to the big picture here is that Nikon probably is one of the vendors that have managed to maintain backwards compatibility to the greatest extent and for the longest time. So all that in itself is very impressive. Now then came the digital age. And what do you do when you move from analog to digital? Well, Nikon decided to maintain the F-mount and didn't change anything. All they did was to change the internal mechanics, you can say, or the internal, content of the camera. So they basically, and this is the Nikon D700, a wonderful digital camera that many of those of you who follow this channel know. But basically, it's exactly the same. Same interface, same everything. Nothing to be seen here in terms of the digital. You have to go to the other side to see that there's no way to install a film here, and you have LCD here on the rear, which is a new thing relative to the analog days. But otherwise, everything was the same. Everyone could use their glass. Everyone was happy. The transition from analog to digital was made successfully, and Nikon could still have, backwards compatibility. You could buy lenses that were 50 years old and they would fit well onto the Nikon D700. There are some exceptions, pre-AI and all that, but let's just stick with the big picture. That is the way it is. Then came the mirrorless revolution, and Nikon decided to make a new interface. And it looks like this, so you can see it's a little bit bigger. And there are some advantages because you can bring now the rear of the glass closer to the sensor, and that gives some advantages in terms of lens design. At least that is the story that the Nikon has explained. More skeptical photographers will say, well, Nikon was just trying to maximize the sort of their bottom line and make it necessary for you to change both your camera and your glass when moving to the mirrorless world. The problem, though, that Nikon had, especially in the beginning of the mirrorless cameras, was there was very little glass for the new interface, so you didn't really have many options. So I think primarily for that reason, but perhaps also to make people with good F-mount glass happy, they came up with this concept of an adapter, and it's called FTZ, not surprisingly, the adapter. And it's basically just, makes the old interface and the new interface talk to each other, so that you put this between your old glass and your new camera body, and then you can reuse your old glass. And let me just show you, speaking of old glass, because you may be thinking, why don't you just move to a new glass? Well, one reason is that it's very expensive. Another is that maybe you have some glass where you have a feeling that will never be produced again. So an example of glass that I think will never be made for the mirrorless cameras is this 135 f2 lens, defocus control, which is an absolutely wonderful lens. And the point was not to try and sell you this lens, just to say that many people are of the opinion that the old glass made for, especially made back for the film days, but also glass like this, has something that is different than the more, you can say, clinical modern lens. There is a certain charm associated with these lenses, other than some of them being amazingly sharp in itself. There is something about these lenses which is difficult to reproduce with a modern lens. So for that reason, I would, if I was to move to the mirrorless world, I would be absolutely insisting that there would be an adapter so I could use this lens on my mirrorless camera. The autofocus motor sits here in the camera body on the Nikon D700 and many of the DSLRs, and unfortunately this motor didn't make it to the mirrorless cameras, and that means that all your lenses, AF lenses, that assumes that your camera body has a built-in autofocus motor, they won't work on the mirrorless cameras, not even if you have an adapter. There simply isn't, now I just grabbed the Viltrox one, there isn't any motor built into the adapter, and there's no motor in the mirrorless camera. So even though you have what I would call mechanical autofocus, you actually don't have that. You have a manual focus lens if you want to use it on your mirrorless camera. The mirrorless camera assumes that you have your motor built into the lens, and this is the case for all the Z glass, but here you can see here I have an AFS, and that means that the motor is built into the lens, and that works fine. If I put the adapter on this one and then mount it on my mirrorless camera, this combination works fine. There's no issue here. It focuses beautifully, and all the things like, you know, face detection and whatnot, it works like a charm, but it only works when you have the motor in the glass. So all your AF glass, for instance, this lens that I showed you just before, the 135 here, this one I'm left with manual focus. That's just the way it is, and I doubt that we will see that there will come an adapter with a built-in motor, because the motor then needs to talk to, somehow to get a way to talk to the image sensor to figure out if it needs to zoom in or out. So I don't think that will ever happen, unfortunately. So be aware that if you have AF glass, then you're left with manual focus. And finally, I want to show you this lens, which is a lens that I have bought after I bought my mirrorless camera. So this is a little bit the other way around. So I have always wanted this lens, the 70 to 200 millimeter 1.2G Mark II. 10-15 years ago, if you were a photojournalist, this was probably your go-to pro lens. It's an absolutely wonderful lens, and I really like it. I know I can never afford this lens made for the mirrorless. That's way too expensive for my budget. But this one used, I could afford. So actually I have, after I got my mirrorless camera, bought this one. And yeah, so it can work both ways. I'm not sure this is the way Nikon wants you to do it, but it works for me. And I think they interact really, really well. Finally, I want to bring to your attention that when you use an adapter, the connection here is a little bit, I wouldn't say weak, but it is fragile in the sense that it cannot take very much strain. And especially when you're using it with a lens this big and this heavy, then if you carry your camera in the camera straps on your camera, potentially you will put a lot of strain on the FTZ adapter. And that, I think, is not good. And I think also if you read the instructions, they recommend that you do it in a different way. So you can see here, I have my camera strap attached to the lens itself, and that way it gives a good balance actually. If I just do like this, you can see it's a good balance there. I'm now just lifting it in the camera strap, and this works for me. But the advantage is that you don't damage the FTZ adapter. So be mindful that it is a little bit fragile, I would say, because you you add some more gearing to the weight that you put on your lens mount. So be a little bit careful with that. This lens has a little rubber gasket. You can see that it sits right here, and it keeps pretty well water and dust out. I mean, it's not like it's waterproof, but it helps keeping out water and dust. And when it sits on my F-mount, the cameras, you can see that then the interface here is pretty well protected. The problem is here that even though there is a little rubber gasket here, as far as I can tell, or at least a little edge here, it's not very good at keeping out water and dust, and that means that this interface, or the inner part of the FTZ adapter, is prone to take in dust and water, as far as I can tell. And I actually have a little video about that. I was out shooting one day, and all of a sudden the camera started acting funny, and that was because water had entered here between the FTZ adapter and the camera. So be a little bit careful with that. I would recommend that if you're going out where there's lots of water, make sure that you put your camera in a plastic wrapping of some sort, or a solution that will keep out the water. I hope this was useful. As always, thank you for watching. Take care. Bye bye.